Hello, the purpose of this TOEFL mini tutoring is to give you an insight into my private TOEFL tutoring courses. Today we will focus on note-taking, the hidden fifth section of the TOEFL IBT test. Most students assume that they know how to take notes because they used to take notes throughout their prior education. However, TOEFL note-taking is an entirely different animal. Unlike school-related note-taking, TOEFL note-taking must be done in such a manner that you are able to use your notes in the next couple minutes. Due to this reason and the extremely strict time constraints, you must use extreme shorthand note-taking, an extremely bold version of the note-taking you are used to. From what I have seen in the past 15 years, testing companies make two enormous mistakes. Most often, they ignore the importance of note-taking, making the same incorrect assumption as their students. A few testing companies are aware of the fact that extreme shorthand note-taking can make your life much more easy by protecting your short-term cache memory, which should be reserved for answering questions during this intellectual marathon. However, as it is very typical with testing companies, they overcomplicate the treatment of the topic by both breaking it down too much and combining it with what they call summarizing and paraphrasing. Testing companies fail to realize that, thought properly, extreme shorthand note-taking will automatically take care of summarizing a passage or a listening. So let's look at the cornerstone of efficient TOEFL note-taking, the structure-based extreme shorthand note-taking employing your own personal notation for nouns. So let's look at this sheet, and it's entitled TOEFL note-taking, which is based on structure, as I mentioned before, and anticipation. You must anticipate the structure of the listening or the reading passages during the integrated assignments. In fact, I coded it. I used the acronym TNR, which stands for triggers, nouns, relationships. The triggers are simply there for you to pay attention to, and you don't want to take notes on them. They help you anticipate the structure based on which you will shorthand the listening or the reading passage. So you take shorthand notes of what? Of the nouns and the relationships, okay? That's why I use this bracket. Now let's see what are the different categories that could be anticipated. The first category that is anticipated, the first structure that is anticipated in listening or reading, is what I call processes. And the triggers corresponding to processes are the following: first, second, third, next, then, last, finally, before, after, at the same time, meanwhile, now, as soon as, later, subsequently, step, stage, phase, eventually, otherwise, to begin with, after that, in addition, concurrently, simultaneously, how X works, and there are many others. Here I just try to list out a bunch of them, but there could be others as well. What's important, you need to recognize these types of triggers, okay? Now let's see how we would shorthand this, okay? There is the shorthand row. And let's assume that the professor in the listening states that the topic of his lecture or her lecture is ultrasound, and I immediately code it with an acronym US, which stands for ultrasound, in order to avoid having to write it down in a lengthy way for which I don't have time. And then I always like to mark by 1 the start of the process, and I make a process diagram for this kind of structure, lecture structure or reading structure, but mostly it's in the lectures. So the professor says that we use a transmitter which we place on the body of a patient. So there is patient. And the transmitter generates ultrasound, which goes through the organs or one particular organ of the patient, and then it gets reflected. So that's why I coded it reflected ultrasound. Notice the extreme shorthand that I used for that. We don't have time, remember. Then the reflected ultrasound goes through a personal computer, PC, and then the computer obviously processes this information, processed ultrasound, in form of information, and then on the monitor, this processed information appears in form of an image, and the image is viewed by a doctor, and the doctor comes up with the diagnosis based on the information seen on the monitor. And then here we may have some minor information which we can briefly jot down depending on the time that we have left for note taking. Okay, so let's move on to the next anticipated listening or reading structure, which I called categories. And the triggers for that are the following, or some of the triggers: kinds of, types of, classes of, groups of, parts of, properties of, characteristics of, varieties of. There are 3 categories. We distinguish 4 major types. Or we might even have this structure, which is a bit tougher because it's in sequence, and so it's not so obvious like the previous examples. So for example, we may have the professor saying legends, and then a definition follows, and then a lot of details which we should ignore. However, that's a trigger word, myths, okay? And the definition for that. So we do have 2 categories here, legends and myths, and 2 definitions, and then some details. But if we have integrated speaking exercises, and if this exercise appears in the reading, then we might want to write down just the definition of the myths and legends. Okay. How do we shorthand this? Okay. So let's see. Let's assume that the professor talks about drainage patterns in the lecture. So let's code it immediately with an acronym DP to save time. And we want to draw 3. We want to draw sort of like a decision tree. So drainage patterns, maybe we have a definition which we want to jot down. And then we connect with the following categories. We have the dendritic drainage patterns, and then we have a figure on the screen, so we need to sketch it quickly. It doesn't have to be artistic, it's too time consuming if we do that. And then, of course, we will have some details. We have to write them down in a simplified fashion. Then the professor moves on to the radial drainage patterns, and then we have a figure appearing on the screen again. We sketch it very quickly, and then very briefly we jot down the details, and the professor is moving on to the third branch, third category, rectangular drainage patterns. Again, a figure on the screen which we should quickly sketch, some details very briefly, moving on to the next category, trellis drainage patterns. Figure again, sketch it quickly, simplify details quickly, and then basically we are done. Good. What is the third type of structure we should anticipate? Chronology. And the triggers for that, maybe a specific example: 250 million years ago, 150 million years ago, 100 million years ago, today. These examples all pertain to the same case study. Now, maybe we could look at another case study where the triggers includes things like in the ancient era, in the Middle Ages, during the industrial era, the Jurassic period. Okay? How do we shorthand this? Well, it has a very specific shorthand. We make a timeline. Okay, we draw it vertically so that we can save scratch paper and space on our scratch paper. We want to be effective, efficient, and then we just pay attention. Of course, I forgot to say that the professor may states that this lecture is about continental drift. Okay, and then we just zero in on the major items here. So 250 million years ago, what is the major event that happened? We jot that down. And then there might be some minor issues, but we need to be careful. Maybe we don't have time to write those down. So as soon as the professor moves on to the next important time frame, 150 million years ago, we leave the minor details and we are moving on to this part. And then we jot down the related major issues. And then some minor events, we might want to write those down, but in the moment the professor moves on to the next major event, 100 million years ago, and the related major issues, then we write that down. And the minor issues, we may or we may not want to write it down, depending on how much time we have until the professor is moving on to the next big time frame. Today, there are some issues again today. We have 7 continents today. And then minor things, again, depends on how much time we have left. So we are done with this structure. The fourth type of listening or reading structure we anticipate is what we call opinions of authority figures. Now, an authority figure could also be a professor, obviously, so the opinion of the professor is signaled by the concluding remarks. So, in conclusion, to sum up. So please pay attention to that, to the professor's opinion. But in addition to the professor's opinion, we also have other opinions, which we call other authority figures, and their triggers are the following. According to the Australian Department of Education. So the capitalized letters are a good indication of an authority figure, some kind of institution or a famous person. The next trigger, the Food Quality Protection Act ensures that blah, blah, blah. Okay? Again, it's capitalized, the beginning usually in a text. Here I have everything capitalized, of course. In the listening, you won't see anything, so you just listen to that, okay? The next one is, let's say, the Antarctic Treaty provides for blah, 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 okay? And many others. And again, don't forget about the professor's opinion as an authority figure, as indicated by conclusion clues. So, in conclusion, to sum up. Okay. How do we shorthand opinions? Well, it's fairly simple. We make an acronym for the authority figure, like the Australian Department of Education, ADE. And then, according to, it's a column. I use a column to shorthand that. And then I write down the major thing related to that. And then there could be some minor issues for which I may or may not have sufficient time to write down. It's the same idea for all the other examples I gave beforehand. So Food Quality Protection Act ensures that, or according to column, some major related idea, and then minor issues that could also be an issue, but I need to be sensitive to time. And then finally, the Antarctic Treaty, according to the Antarctic Treaty, column, major issues and minor issues. Most often, opinions appear in integrated speaking exercises in the reading portion, and many students make the mistake that they think that this reading should be written down thoroughly, should be documented thoroughly, when in fact, usually what's important in it is just finding an opinion. It's finding one or at most 2 sentences and make a shorthand of those. And the majority of your integrated speaking should be based on the listening, okay? But more on that in a personal private tutoring with me. Okay, good. What is the fourth expected listening or reading structure? Definitions. Okay, definitions. So what are the triggers for that? By definition, X is Y. This means that X is known as Y, X is called Y, X refers to Y, where of course X and Y are acronyms for whatever issues, whatever topics are talked about. How do we shorthand that? Is very, very simple for definitions, equal sign, okay? So X equals to Y, and X and Y are acronyms, shorthands. Good. And finally, let's move on to the last anticipated structure, conversations. What are the triggers for that? Well, many students make the mistake of not paying attention to what the narrator says. Well, the narrator gives it away immediately, whether we are dealing with a conversation or a lecture-based listening, okay? In terms of triggers, like trigger words, words such as problem, cause, solution, and then in terms of the type of information you hear, persuasion, evaluation, comparison, contrast. These are all triggers, clues that conversations will come up. And these are the clues for the major issues that we need to jot down. Now, how do we shorthand this? Well, we do it like a movie script, okay? So we do it like this. And then this is very important, man, woman. During conversations, one of the speakers will always be a man and one of the speakers will always be a woman. So please don't call them student, professor, or campus police officer, student, librarian, student, because it's confusing to the graders. It's very easy. You make your life easier if you just call them man, woman, okay? And then we write the information down like a movie script, back and forth. And during conversations, please keep in mind that usually one of the speakers will be more important. So the question will be focused on one of the speakers. And if the question is focused on one of the speakers, then be sure to only talk about that speaker, as you will not have time to talk about the other as well. Okay? So please focus your attention. For more on TOEFL note-taking and getting help with the other TOEFL sections, please sign up for my private tutoring on my website. For additional mini tutoring courses, please subscribe to my YouTube channel or follow me on Facebook.